Hi, this is Ben Kissling, and this is my video series on William Lane Craig and Genesis. It has been quite a while since I did the last episode, episode 9, but we are still looking at the video and lecture series called Defenders 3 Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity. That is William Lane Craig giving those lectures in a Sunday school class at his church. And it is a very interesting series that took place during most of 2019. It's been quite a while, several months since I last did an episode. But we are still on part 3 of Aging and the Flood. So definitely check out at least episodes 8 and 9. And also hopefully episode 6. Obviously, I'd prefer everybody watch all the episodes, but um, where I'm critiquing Craig's videos. But this episode in particular is somewhat standalone, so I'm just going to discuss two of the most successful creation science theories to date and explain why they're relevant to aging in the flood. Um, Now, originally, I recorded this episode like 2 or 3 times along with what is now episode 11. Realized I had to split them again. So originally all 4 of these episodes were one episode, and I just kept having to split them because they kept going too long. So I promise this is the last split. We'll just talk about the scientific theories today, and then next episode I'll do what I think is a novel interpretation of Genesis 6. So this is the chart of ages we've been looking at, and we've been discussing why people prior to the flood lived about 900 years and why their ages declined so precipitously after the flood. And I suggested that the reason is uh, both an increase in the mutation rate occurring after the flood, but also a steady drip of mutations occurring before the flood that were neutral up until the mutation rate increased, and then an accumulation of neutral mutations eventually led to the degradation of many genetic mechanisms um, that have to do with why the ages decreased. And of course, another big jump is from Adam and Eve in the garden, who were supposed to live forever, and they eventually died. So I went through what I think scientifically happened when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden and why they began to age at that point. So that's all in previous episodes, episode 6, 8, and 9 mostly. And here's a better look at the decline in ages. You'll see a dramatic decline starts at the flood. It is a tricky problem to try and figure out why ages were basically a flat line prior to the flood and then suddenly declined like this. But I think I've made a good case for my position on that. So today I'm going to discuss briefly catastrophic plate tectonics, which is now the consensus flood theory among young Earth creationists who actually know things. It's a theory that was mainly the brainchild of John Baumgartner in the early 1980s. Baumgartner spent some time in the Navy and then went back to school to get a PhD with UCLA, but he actually did his PhD work at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is famous for the place where they tested nuclear bombs during World War II. But Baumgartner himself worked on fluid dynamics, and much of his work has survived and remained useful to this day in climate models, models of fluid dynamics of the Earth's oceans. And he's contributed significantly to one of the 2 major climate models that is still used today with a computer program called Terra. But when Baumgartner finished his PhD at Los Alamos, they wanted to hire him on permanently, and he asked for a condition of his hiring to be that he was allowed to spend half of his time working on a young Earth creationist viewpoint of science. And they said yes, surprisingly, which is very unusual, especially for that time and that time, really, when there was lots of prejudice against young Earth creationism. Baumgartner was given a chance to have the kind of resources that you have at Los Alamos National Laboratory and use them to freely pursue a young Earth creationist theory. And this is what he came up with. And in 1994, um, very important paper on this was published with co-authors of all the really big names in creation science or creation flood geology. Um, so this is now the consensus flood model among educated young Earth creationists. It is endorsed by uh, Andrew Snelling, who is the most important geologist working for Answers in Genesis, which is the largest young Earth creationist organization. It is promoted by the Institute for Creation Research, which is the oldest young Earth creationist organization here in Dallas. And full disclosure, I volunteer for them on occasion. And it is also called by Creation Ministries International to be the flood model that is ahead on points, quote unquote, of other flood models. So I have already done a video on catastrophic plate tectonics explaining the whole theory. It was done live for an adult Sunday school class at my church, and so I'll include the link to that in the description. But I did make a couple of mistakes in that video. I referred to the mantle of the Earth as being a liquid. That's a common misconception. It is technically a solid, but it does not affect the rest of the video. And the second mistake was I said that the jet streams of water that would throw water up into the Earth's atmosphere were occurring at the subduction zones, and actually in the theory they actually occur at the rifting zones, which you'll understand that if you understand plate tectonics. So I'd recommend going to watch that video. Now what we're looking at after the flood, and this is why I believe CPT is related to the age issue, is a ton of severe environmental stressors that would have been the case after the flood. And we understand this a lot better now because of CPT. There would have been a lot of stuff in the air, especially volcanic ash, potentially even a higher amount of radioactivity. And the sun was somewhat blocked out by this ash, and so creationists believe that the ice age occurred shortly after the flood, which would cause weather fluctuations. But what you see here is what's called seismic tomography. It is a way of measuring the temperature of areas deep inside the Earth by measuring sort of the movement of various parts of little pieces of the inner mantle, and how fast they're moving gives you an idea of how or what their temperature is. And so in these pictures you can see the gray sphere is the core of the Earth, and the blue areas are lower temperature areas and the red areas are higher temperature areas. So you kind of see on the right here, you've got these blue areas that are basically right below the Pacific Rim, that area of volcanic activity that marks the plate boundaries of the Pacific Ocean. And CPT suggests that the pre-flood crust of the Earth, the pre-flood oceanic crust, subducted underneath the continents and basically went all the way down to the core of the Earth, basically sunk until they couldn't sink anymore because of a process called thermal runaway. And in doing so, they would displace magma that was warmer than itself up, and it's sort of an upwelling of warmer magma as the cold magma or as the cold oceanic crust subducted and hit the core. Now, why is this evidence for a young Earth? Well, simply because if the Earth was billions of years old, then uh, uh, there would be ample time for the temperature inside the Earth's mantle to equilibrate equally, especially near the core, which is hotter than the mantle. Um, and so, not only do you have much colder areas in the Earth's mantle, on the order of 1,000 degrees cooler, it is also close to the mantle. Um, and that will be significant when we discuss planetary magnetic fields. But there simply was too much time, and if the Earth is 4.5 billion years old or so, uh, all the temperature inside the mantle would have equaled out over that amount of time. And so, really, the Earth has to be either young or massive and rapid plate subduction occurred in the recent past, which did not allow these areas of the mantle to equilibrate in temperature with the rest of it. Okay, and it has to be rapid plate subduction, which is predicted by CPT. The rate of subduction that is occurring today is too slow, and if it's that slow, it will equilibrate anyway, no matter how old or young it is. And so this is evidence both for a young Earth and for rapid plate subduction. Now, I'm basically done discussing catastrophic plate tectonics. The rest of it, I'll point you to my previous video. But it is relevant to the next theory we're going to talk about the Earth's magnetic field, because Baumgartner's mechanism here, specifically the cold pre-flood oceanic crust hitting or close to hitting the Earth's core, gives a mechanism for polarity reversals in the Earth's magnetic field. Now, this is not, and I'm referencing some papers here by Humphreys explaining all of that. Now, everyone agrees that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed in polarity in the past, meaning that the North Pole became the South Pole and vice versa, or at least for the magnetic field, the magnetic poles. Um, that is not controversial. Obviously, what is controversial is how fast it occurred, and Baumgartner's mechanism here was realized by Russell Humphreys, a creationist physicist, again in the early 80s, that this could provide a mechanism for why rapid reversals of the Earth's magnetic field would occur. And it has to do with the temperature difference between the inner mantle and the core. A large temperature difference would result in convection currents in the Earth's core, and this would, Humphreys shows how this could cause polarity reversals in the Earth's magnetic field. Whoops. Okay, so the Earth and several of the planets in our solar system have magnetic fields, and you'll see a picture of it, how it looks here. These are magnetic field lines, and this is over here on the right is a magnet, which is basically the same concept, where it has two poles, and the magnetic field lines go like this. They sort of circles, going all the way around and going in through the poles like that. And the reason why the Earth has a magnetic field, at least if you're a creationist, the reason why uh, is to protect the Earth from solar radiation. Solar radiation is very damaging. Cosmic rays, for example, cause mutations directly, and we'll talk more about what solar radiation does to a planet's atmosphere with no magnetic field. An example of that would be Mars, but we'll talk more about that later. Um, the key here, though, is during magnetic field reversals, the Earth's magnetic field would be weak, and so the Earth's magnetic field would be bombarded by the solar radiation. All right, so how do we know that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed in polarity in the past? Well, that's the interesting part. This here is a graphic of the mid-oceanic ridge. So, like, there's one, the most obvious one is the mid-Atlantic ridge in the Atlantic Ocean. Um, so basically, the arrows you see here are the motions of the subducting oceanic plates. These plates subduct underneath the continents, and so they're slowly, very slowly moving towards the continents from the middle of the ocean where this ridge is. And so this is where the split in the plates occurs, and they sort of go off in opposite directions. And what happens is, as they move apart, uh, magma from underneath the plates wells up because it's warmer, right? It's warm. It'll well up in between the plates and onto the bottom of the ocean where it will eventually cool off. Now, the evidence for polarity reversals has to do with how fast uh, this magma cools and the types of ferromagnetic materials that are in it. Ferromagnetic materials will orient themselves in the direction of the magnetic field, the magnetic poles. And if the magma is hot enough, above about 500 degrees Celsius, um, it's pliable and malleable and liquid enough at that temperature that ferromagnetic materials in the magma will be able to move inside the magma and orient themselves according to the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. However, once the magma cools to below about 500 degrees, it locks it in. It becomes more solid, too solid for the ferromagnetic materials to move again. Okay, so what happens? Well, if you had reversals of the Earth's magnetic field over time, what the ocean the ocean crust should show, should show is stripes of reversing patterns of ferromagnetic materials in the Earth's crust, because once they're cooled down and locked in, they'll stay where they are, even if the Earth's magnetic field reverses. But the new magma, where it's hotter than 500 degrees, the ferromagnetic materials in the new magma can orient themselves to the new direction. And so over time, it'll go back, it'll orient itself north, and then it'll cool down and lock in, and then the new magma will orient itself south when the field reverses, and then eventually as it moves away and cools down, it'll lock in, and the process repeats, and you get this striping pattern, um, just like this. So you can kind of see how the striping pattern develops as the plates subduct away from the center. Okay. Now, Russell Humphreys again predicted, because he was a young Earth creationist, that there would be evidence of rapid polarity reversals. Now, what would this look like? Basically, he predicted that it would be in lava flows from some kind of volcanic activity, similar to uh, the magma coming up in the center of the ocean, but the lava flows would be thin enough that you would calculate them to cool down so rapidly that if there was a striping pattern in these very thin lava flows, that would indicate rapid polarity reversals. And in fact, this evidence was found by secular geologists who weren't exactly looking for it. Um, and many years later, one of them attempted to argue that he was wrong in his initial results. And so there's been a back and forth about that. And Humphreys, I think, has the better of that argument. It's essentially an ad hoc explanation away from the data when they found out that it was predicted by young Earth creationists for young Earth creationist reasons. And so we do have evidence of rapid polarity reversals, just as Humphreys suggested, and are shown by his model of how they're caused by the flood. Okay, so even more interesting than this is in 1984, before Voyager 2 measured the magnetic fields of the outer planets, Russell Humphreys predicted the strength of the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune, again, before they were measured in 1986 and 1989. He did so, again, on the basis of a young Earth creationist theory of how the planetary magnetic fields formed to begin with. And this is the meat of what we're going to talk about today. Um, so, Humphrey's basic theory here is if you've ever heard of MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, a medical application, where you basically, you've seen them in movies probably, you kind of insert someone's body into this big circular thing, and then they sort of create this image of inside the human body. Well, in college, I actually they teach you this as nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR. It's the same basic technology, the same basic method, uh, but when they first applied it to medicine and medical applications, they found out that people were scared of it because it had the word nuclear in it. And so they changed the name to magnetic resonance imaging. But in academics, it's known as NMR, or nuclear magnetic resonance. And the basic idea is that some atomic nuclei, like these hydrogen nuclei that you see here, have a very, very, very tiny magnetic field, which can be detected by a larger magnetic field. And if you've ever seen an NMR machine or an MRI machine, they do not let you go near it with metal in your pockets, or metal on you, because it's a giant magnet basically. And the magnet is sensitive enough that it can detect these tiny little magnetic fields in atomic nuclei. Okay. Now, normally, again, this is just a picture of how the magnet applies to an atomic nuclei. This would be a hydrogen nuclei here with one proton and one electron, and it has a magnetic pole, and it generates this very tiny magnetic field. Now, normally, if you have a glass of water, this is water here, you'll see there's two hydrogens, two H's, and one oxygen, one O, H2O. This is a water molecule. Normally, the hydrogen nuclei in a water molecule will be topsy-turvy every which direction, and as a result of that, the magnetic fields cancel each other out often. Um, and and part of the way MRIs work is they sort of line them up and flip them around a bunch of times, and that's how they detect it. But we won't get into that. So, what was Humphrey's theory about the formation of planets? Well, Humphreys looked at the Bible and said, well, look, the Earth started out as water, H2O. And so this suggests a potential origin for magnetic fields if the initial position of all the water molecules, or rather all the hydrogen atoms in the water molecules, were all aligned when God created them ex nihilo into existence. And if the hydrogen atoms were all aligned in the same orientation, their magnetic fields would combine into a one very large magnetic field, giving the Earth its magnetic field. Now, immediately after this, uh, they would again suddenly go topsy-turvy, and their magnetic fields would then cancel out. But because of, I'm forgetting the name of this scientific principle, but basically, if there is a magnetic field around a conductor, which water is a conductor, an electric conductor, the magnetic field would generate an electric current. And an electric current, in turn, generates a magnetic field. So even though after the moment of creation, when they're all lined up, they wouldn't be lined up anymore, all these nuclei. But what would happen is an electric current would be generated in the water of the planet initially, and then later inside the core, and then that would generate a magnetic field and keep a magnetic field going. However, it would degrade over time due to the resistance to the electric current. And so this is a theory which Humphreys set to a physical record of measurements of the decline in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field and the timing of 6,000 years of creation, and showed, well, and predicted what the strengths of the magnetic fields of Uranus and Neptune would be before they were measured. Now, he also predicted the strengths of other magnetic fields, which had already been measured as well. Okay, so this is an important fulfilled prediction from an explicitly young Earth creationist theory, which no one knows about because they're young Earth creationists, and who cares because they're all crazy. Okay, so there's your picture of how the atomic nuclei line up, where the magnetic fields are all in the same direction, and they would add together sort of like a vector addition into one large magnetic field. But over here, they're all topsy-turvy, so they don't generate a field. And then this is how you see two magnets when they're lined up. These field lines show how the magnetic fields of the two different magnets will combine into a larger field when their polarity is lined up. I guess I should have shown that slide earlier. And this is Humphreys' two different models for the decline of the Earth's magnetic field strength, which was documented by another creationist named Barnes, I believe. And Humphreys took his data and turned it into this theory. Now, his original, more obvious theory assumed that 25% of the original hydrogen nuclei were aligned when the planets were created, and that gave you the free decay model, where it just decayed at a constant rate over 6,000 years. But Humphreys later realized that he could say that 100% of the atomic nuclei were aligned at the beginning, and then this would give you an additional amount of energy in the magnetic field, because more hydrogen nuclei make a bigger magnetic field, stronger one, and that would allow for a rather large drop in the energy of the magnetic field occurring at the flood due to these polarity reversals, which would cause a lot of loss in energy. And keep in mind, this is maximum energy, which is different from the strength measurements, which I forget the units of that, but it's not measured in units. It's a direct measurement of a magnetic field strength, but it's the energy that is dropping consistently over time. Okay, so this is a closer look at the dynamic decay model. And the reversals that would occur because of the flood and after the flood would be rapid at first, but then slowly they would slow down over time. And I believe Humphreys says that that basically the fluctuations would have eventually stopped around 1300 AD, so not actually that long ago, but I don't remember the exact specifics there. But this is basically what it would look like. These fluctuations would take a giant chunk out of the energy of the magnetic field, which again, remember, it's strong. It's very strong at the beginning of creation to protect the Earth's atmosphere and the rest of the Earth from solar radiation. But right after the flood, with these reversals, it was very, very weak. And so the mutation rate I'm arguing would have increased for various reasons because of that. But it's actually stronger now um, because the fluctuations have stopped oscillating. But it is still measurably decaying on the order of, I believe it's about 7% per century, I think. Or I think it's declined 7% in the last 150 years or so since it's been measured. I think that adds up to about 5% per century. So it's a very significant decline. All right, so why do polarity reversals of the Earth's magnetic field cause an increase in the mutation rate? Well, quite simply, it's because it allows cosmic rays into the Earth's atmosphere, which directly cause mutations in life forms. Now, this mutation rate increase would not be enough to account for um, the decrease in the rapid decline in aging after the flood. However, I'm going to argue that there are all kinds of other uh, in that's called stress-induced mutagenesis after the flood, which we talked about last episode. But I wanted to talk about a specific possibility here, which I found really interesting. This is a little bit of a speculation. Okay, it's a lot of speculation on my part, but I found this really interesting paper by secular scientists about applying the model of Mars to the Earth during the polarity reversals. Now, remember, everyone agrees polarity reversals occurred, just the timing that is disputed. So, an old Earth person would believe that the reversals took much, much longer to occur than Humphreys is suggesting. And so, what happens is they have all these satellites around Mars. In fact, they sent one in 2015 to Mars specifically to study the interaction between the solar radiation and Mars's atmosphere. That was a satellite called MAVEN. To my knowledge, it is done with this study and has been turned into a communication satellite, but I haven't seen any new papers. This paper I'm referencing is from 2014. Um, so Mars has a very small induced magnetic field, but it has no native magnetic field that's generated by its core, the way Earth does and you know, Uranus and Neptune do. The magnetic field it has is very tiny, and it's induced by the interaction with the solar radiation and what remains of Mars's atmosphere. Now, Mars's atmosphere is almost uniform, and now I can't remember whether it's methane or carbon dioxide, but it has no or very, very little oxygen in it. And it turns out there's an explanation for why there's very little oxygen in it. It's a complicated mechanism, but it has to do with solar radiation. When the solar radiation hits an atmosphere with oxygen in it, a complex cascade of events occurs, which I'm not going to go through it here, but basically it excites oxygen ions in the atmosphere to the point where they basically will shoot out into space and escape the gravity of the planet. And so over time, if a planet like Mars has no magnetic field, eventually the oxygen will just bleed out of the atmosphere. And the solar radiation is basically like smacking it out of the park like a baseball bat. Just bam. Okay. And so what these guys theorized was that during polarity reversals, Earth's atmosphere was exposed to the solar radiation just like Mars's was for a long time. And that would have significantly reduced the concentration of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere. And they think it could be as much as a 5% reduction over a very long period of time on the old Earth scale. And so they hypothesized that this reduction in oxygen from 21, 22% all the way down to 16 to 17% in the atmosphere could have caused mass extinction events. Evolutionists believe because of the fossil record does not fit gradualism, as Darwin predicted it would. Uh, they have to hypothesize several mass extinction events to explain the fossil record. And so these guys are hypothesizing that one of these mass extinction events was caused by hypoxia, lack of oxygen, killed off, the dinosaurs or whatever, because of these polarity reversals and the reduction in oxygen that they caused in a certain period of time when there was no magnetic field protection, which is super interesting. From a young Earth perspective, there would not be as much time to reduce oxygen in the atmosphere, but you're really not needing that amount of time because you're not trying to explain a mass extinction event. All you're trying to do is explain an amount of hypoxia that's enough to induce a higher mutation rate. And so this is a potentially another source of an increased mutation rate in biological populations in the centuries after the flood. Okay, which I think fits well with the young Earth creationist model in several angles. But again, this is speculation on my part. Some young Earth creationists with better knowledge than me would have to look at Humphrey's model and see how much oxygen over how much time could could be knocked out of the atmosphere and how much hypoxia and mutation rate that would cause. Um, so that's kind of a fun idea that I realized reading some papers on these topics. Okay, let's discuss Uranus. Why am I discussing Uranus? Well, it goes back to Humphrey's theory about the formation of magnetic fields. The planets were formed by water. Initially, they had a magnetic field due to hydrogen nuclei being lined up. This causes an electric current inside the planet, which in turn generates a magnetic field. Now, why is this relevant to the age question? Well, because over time, resistance in the core of the Earth and the other planets would cause the electric current rather, to lose energy, and the magnetic field would degrade over time, much, much too fast for an old Earth or an old solar system. So, old Earth astronomers and physicists have to explain why we still have magnetic fields in the Earth and some of these other planets if they're so old. And the answer they came up with is called the heat dynamo theory or the magnetic dynamo theory. Now, this theory is based on the idea that um, the basically the rotation of planets will cause enough movement in the core of the planet to regenerate the electric current. And that keeps the field fluctuating but strong enough to maintain itself over billions of years. So without this, it would not maintain itself. Now there are lots of technical problems with the heat dynamo theory. Right on the face of it, just on the merits of the theory itself, it is not as good as Humphrey's theory. Um, but there are some interesting things about Uranus in particular that are compelling evidence. And the main one is that there's no measurable internal heat coming from Uranus, which means that the heat dynamo theory cannot work for Uranus because the inside of Uranus, the core of it, is not hot enough to have that kind of movement generated in it by its rotation, and so it can't generate a magnetic field. So old agers have to come up with a completely ad hoc, different theory about why Uranus even has a magnetic field to begin with. I guess I already mentioned that. The other problem that Uranus presents here is that it is a sideways rotating planet. The axis of rotation is pointed straight at the sun, whereas the Earth's axis is sort of at almost perpendicular to the sun, but at a angle of 23.5 degrees, as I'm sure you remember from high school science. But Uranus is something like or well, it's almost straight on. One of the poles is almost facing the sun. Now, why is that an issue? Well, first of all, it's an issue for the theory about the formation of the solar system because they say that the planets came from the star, the sun. The sun formed first, stars formed first, and eventually it broke off and spun off the planets, basically. And so, if you can picture a spinning top breaking into little pieces, what would happen to those pieces? Well, they'd all be spinning in the same direction. But of course, the planets in the solar system are not all spinning in the same direction. Um, some of them are spinning backwards, um, but Uranus is spinning on its side, and so all the theories about this are about how this could be postulate that well they were hit by giant asteroids and then knocked the whole planet off its axis. But of course, we've never seen that happen. That is also ad hoc explanation. Um, but as it regards to the magnetic field, it turns out Uranus's magnetic field is at a 60-degree uh, difference from the axis of rotation. So not only is the axis of rotation off from where it should be if it formed from the sun, as Big Bang theorists speculate, but the magnetic field is at a 60-degree rotation off of the axis of rotation of the planet, which is another reason why the dynamo theory doesn't work for Uranus's magnetic field. Okay, so I've seen their answers for this. They say that, well, the magnetic field of Uranus has to do with ice crystals, sulfur dioxide ice crystals in the atmosphere or something. But again, it's completely ad hoc theory and undemonstrated and very speculative. Humphrey's theory explains why Uranus has a magnetic field with the same theory as magnetic fields for any of the other planets. So it's not ad hoc. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Next video, I'm going to do a novel interpretation of Genesis 6. Uh, the first 4 verses of Genesis 6 have been controversial for thousands of years, long before some Christians decided that science trumps the Bible. So that will be very interesting, and I think, as far as I can tell, it's a novel interpretation. So these are the two theories of young Earth creationists that I think are the best supported by the evidence. Catastrophic plate tectonics and Humphrey's theory about the formation of the planetary magnetic fields. They both have generated testable predictions that have been confirmed, and they're consistent with each other to the point where CPT explains aspects of the magnetic field theory. So these are very good theories by any definition of what counts as a good scientific theory, but of course they are ignored by the mainstream academy because they both implicate and show scientific evidence that the Bible is correct and the earth is young.